Hello Whisky fans, you might get a bit of a sense of deja vu with this video. Because today I'm going to be looking at the miniature of Ardbeg 10-year-old that came in this presentation tin with a miniature of Ardbeg 17-year-old. But I promise this is a review of a very different Ardbeg 10. When I bought this presentation tin of the Ardbeg 10 17-year-old, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't particularly excited about getting a 50ml measure of the Ardbeg 10-year-old. It's something that's been readily available in most places for quite a while, and it's something that I always have in the house anyway. And I nearly gave this one away, but in hindsight that would have been a big mistake, because as soon as I put this into the glass, you can really tell that it's very different to the modern Ardbeg 10-year-old. So looking at the label on this miniature, we know that it's bottled at 46%. Another good thing about Ardbeg products is that they almost always have a bottling code. Sometimes it's etched into the glass, sometimes it'll be on the label. It's usually hard to read, and in most cases you can't actually tell much from the code itself. But there are resources online to allow you to read those codes and turn it into something that will actually tell you when your Ardbeg product was actually bottled. And from that, I know that this miniature was bottled in November of 2002, which is interesting in itself, because that means that the youngest whisky that can go into this 10-year-old single malt was being distilled in 1992, when Ardbeg was in a state of semi-mothballed, basically. So production was scaled right back, producing very small quantities of whisky until the owners either sold or dismantled or reopened the distillery. So all points to a similar situation to what we had with the Ardbeg 17-year-old, that the whisky going into this bottling, the same as the 17-year-old, may be a lot older than the age statement on the label. So let's give it a nose and a taste and see what we've got. Straight away on the nose you can tell that this is a whisky that doesn't have much at all in common with the modern Ardbeg 10-year-old. It's really not a 10-year-old whisky. In fact, I'd say it's nowhere near a 10-year-old whisky. It smells and tastes really quite old. In particular, there's a note in there which is a pure, sweet maltiness, but it's not your young, youthful, barley, cereal gristiness. It's a note of an aged barley spirit, which has been aged past that raw material into something oily and nutty. And you can say what you want about your old versus young whiskies and your no age statements, but this note in particular that I'm getting in this whisky is something that you never get in your younger single malts, and it's something that I personally really like. This is definitely not a 10-year-old Ardbeg. Also getting quite a lot of salinity there, so lots of brininess and sea air, and there's almost a note of sort of sweet, light grist soaked in seawater. And I think the reason why, because you get that briny quality in the Ardbeg 10, the modern bottling, I think the reason why I'm picking that out more so in this one is that the peat is noticeably absent in this whisky. It's definitely there, but it's nowhere near the power that you get in the modern 10-year-old, and I think that's because of the extra age that this whisky has had. And that extra age has really allowed the spirit to mellow out and fully showcase the complexity that this whisky has picked up from all those extra years. There's a beautiful musty lemon note mixed in there with that gristiness, and a little tiny hint of lime as well, and a faint waft of stale peat smoke and a little bit of cigarette ash. I'm also getting a mild note of darkly roasted coffee beans. Really is a beautiful nose. On the palate I'm getting lots of sweet oranges and some milk chocolate as well, and that sweet orangey note really intertwines with that lovely, sweet, mature, oily, nutty maltiness that was on the nose. Also worth mentioning that this whisky has a phenomenal mouthfeel as well. It really coats your palate and your tongue, and it's just a wonderful experience. There is also a slight hint of an ashy peat in there, but it's really very mild. In this one, the peat really is more of a feeling and a texture. It's more of a backdrop and an accent. As for the finish, as with the whole experience, it's really, really malty. From start to finish, there's really this profound note of maltiness, this note of old age. But what there isn't anything of at all is there's no bitterness, there's no tannins, there's no sense of spending too long in the cask. And I keep coming back to this again and again. What this old peater, sort of creamy peat smoke, malty style really reminds me of is something like the Longrow 18 or even the Longrow 21. I do think that there is more peat in this miniature of the 2002 vintage Ardbeg 10 than the Ardbeg 17, but it's still really very mild and very subtle, especially compared to anything that Ardbeg produce these days. As for a grade, I'm going to give it an A-. It's a fantastic whisky, and I really wish that it was easier to get hold of these. So which do I prefer out of the old 2002 vintage Ardbeg 10-year-old and the modern 10? It's really difficult to say because I think they're just completely different whiskies, and I really want both. The modern Ardbeg 10 is a phenomenal whisky. It's probably the most trustworthy and repeatably high quality whisky that you can buy these days. It's just an outstanding whisky for anyone that appreciates peated whisky. But what you get in this old bottling is a much mellower and milder experience. You're really trading a lot of that power and peat for lots more age and complexity, for want of a better word. It really seems that it wasn't just the famous Ardbeg 17-year-old that got a big boost back in those early days. I think this 10-year-old has as well. And I'd actually say that this miniature of 10-year-old from 2002 is actually much closer in style to the Ardbeg 17-year-old than it is the modern 10. So that raises another question. How do I rate the old style 10-year-old compared to the now discontinued 17? Now, in my opinion, I think they are quite close to each other. And something that's quite interesting about that is the wildly different ABVs, because the 17-year-old is at 40% and the 10-year-old is 46%. But the mouthfeel and the intensity and the experience is actually remarkably similar, to the point where when I first opened this 10-year-old, I actually wondered if there was some fantastic mistake at the distillery and it had actually given me 2 miniatures of the 17-year-old. Now, I don't think that is the case, because there is a little bit more peat in the 10-year-old from 2002 than there is in the Ardbeg 17-year-old. But if I were to taste these whiskies together in a blind tasting, I'd probably guess the Ardbeg 17-year-old to be something in the low 20s, and the Ardbeg 10 from 2002 I'd probably put around the 18 to 20-year-old mark. You can tell that they are similar whiskies. You'd probably guess that they're from the same distillery, but I would guess the ages of the 2 different vattings to not be too dissimilar. Just goes to show that it's always worth keeping an open mind about these things.